The gunshot tore through Kyle Patterson's thigh on a scorching July afternoon in 1873, and by the time he collapsed against the hitching post outside the general store in Genoa, Nevada, blood was already soaking through his denim and pooling in the dust beneath him. Grace Thompson heard the commotion from inside her father's store where she'd been counting inventory, her hands stilling on the sacks of flour as shouts erupted in the street. She ran to the door and saw a man crumpled on the wooden boardwalk, his hat fallen beside him, his face contorted in pain. Two other men were riding away at full gallop, their horses kicking up clouds of dirt that hung in the still summer air. "Someone get the doctor," Grace shouted, already moving toward the wounded man. She dropped to her knees beside him, her calico skirt spreading around her in the dust. His eyes met hers, dark brown and glazed with shock, and she saw he couldn't have been more than 25 years old. His black hair was matted with sweat against his forehead. "Got caught in a dispute that wasn't mine," he managed through gritted teeth, his drawl thick with pain. "Wrong place, wrong damn time." "Don't talk," Grace said firmly, pressing her hands against the wound even as blood seeped warm between her fingers. She was 22 and had helped tend injuries before, living in a frontier town where violence flared as quickly as summer lightning. "Dr. Willis is coming." But Dr. Willis was 3 miles out at the Morrison Ranch, tending to a difficult birth, and wouldn't return until nightfall. The shopkeeper, Grace's father Thomas, helped carry Kyle inside and onto the narrow cot in the back room where they sometimes let travelers rest. Grace worked quickly, cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of his trousers while her father heated water on the stove. The bullet had gone clean through, which was fortunate, but the wound was ragged and deep. Grace cleaned it as best she could with hot water and the whiskey her father kept under the counter, trying not to flinch when Kyle's body went rigid with pain. His fingers gripped the edge of the cot so hard his knuckles turned white. "What's your name?" she asked, trying to distract him as she worked. "Kyle Patterson," he gasped. "Riding through to Carson City, was supposed to meet my brother there tomorrow." "Well, Kyle Patterson, you're going to be here a bit longer than you planned." Grace finished bandaging the wound with clean strips of cloth torn from old sheets. "That needs proper doctoring, but this will have to do until Dr. Willis gets back." By the time the doctor arrived that evening, Kyle was running a fever. Dr. Willis examined the wound, cleaned it again more thoroughly, and gave Grace strict instructions about changing the dressings and watching for signs of infection. Then he left to attend to 2 minors who'd gotten into a knife fight at one of the saloons down the street. Grace's father offered Kyle the cot for as long as he needed it. Thomas Thompson was a good man, weathered by years in the Nevada territory, but still possessing the kind of frontier hospitality that meant turning no one away who needed help. Grace brought Kyle water throughout the night, checking his temperature, listening to his labored breathing in the darkness of the storeroom. 3 days passed, and the wound wasn't healing right. The skin around it stayed inflamed and hot to the touch, despite Grace cleaning it twice daily with carbolic solution the doctor had left. Kyle's fever came and went in waves, leaving him weak and unable to stand for more than a few minutes at a time. Dr. Willis came by when he could, but he was the only physician for miles, and his time was stretched thin across the growing territory. "Keep doing what you're doing," he told Grace on the 5th day, examining the angry red flesh around the bullet wound. "Sometimes these things just take time. The body has its own schedule for healing." But Grace could see the concern in his eyes, the way he lingered a moment too long before leaving. She'd seen wounds like this before, seen them turn septic and claim lives despite everyone's best efforts. The thought made something tighten in her chest, though she barely knew this man who'd stumbled into their lives. Kyle was a patient in more ways than one. Even when the pain was clearly wearing him down, he managed to smile when Grace came to change his dressings. He told her about growing up in Texas, about his brother who'd moved to Carson City to try his hand at silver mining, about the ranch his family had lost to drought and debt when he was 19. His voice was rich and warm even when roughened by fever, and Grace found herself staying longer than necessary during each visit, sitting on the stool beside the cot while her father minded the store. "You don't have to spend so much time back here," Kyle said one afternoon, watching her prepare fresh bandages. Sunlight filtered through the small window, illuminating dust motes in the air. "I'm sure you have better things to do than tend to some stranger." "Actually, inventory is incredibly boring," Grace replied, wringing out a cloth in the basin of water. "You're much more interesting than counting sacks of cornmeal." He laughed, then winced as the movement pulled at his injury. "I'll try to remember that when I'm lying here feeling useless." "You're not useless. You're healing." Grace moved closer, beginning the now familiar process of unwrapping the old bandages. The wound looked no better than yesterday, still seeping and inflamed. She kept her expression neutral, not wanting him to see her worry. "Doesn't feel much like healing," Kyle observed quietly. "Feels like it's getting worse." Grace couldn't lie to him. "It's being stubborn," she admitted, "but we'll keep fighting it. I'm not giving up if you're not." Something shifted in his gaze then, a warmth that had nothing to do with fever. "I believe you." A week became 2, and the wound remained unchanged. Grace cleaned it every morning and every evening, applying fresh poultices that Dr. Willis prepared from herbs and medicines whose names she could barely pronounce. She boiled the bandages religiously, kept everything as clean as possible in a dusty frontier town where cleanliness was a constant battle against the elements. Kyle grew stronger in some ways, his appetite returning, but the injury itself seemed trapped in a state of perpetual inflammation. "My brother must think I'm dead," Kyle said one evening as Grace worked by lamplight. Thomas had already closed the store and retired to their living quarters upstairs, leaving Grace to her ministrations. "Or that I just decided not to come." "We sent word to Carson City," Grace reminded him. "The circuit rider took a letter 2 days ago. Your brother will know you're here and recovering." "Recovering," Kyle repeated with a bitter edge. "That's generous." Grace paused in her work, meeting his eyes. "You're alive. That counts for something." "Thanks to you." His voice softened. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there that day. Someone else would have helped." But even as Grace said it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. Genoa was a good town by frontier standards, but people were often too busy with their own struggles to notice someone else's pain. She'd made Kyle her responsibility, and somewhere in the daily routine of caring for him, he'd become more than just a patient. They talked about everything during those long hours. Grace told him about growing up in Nevada, about how her mother had died of influenza when Grace was 16, about the loneliness of being one of the few unmarried women her age in a town where most girls were wed by 20. Kyle spoke of his dreams to start fresh somewhere, to build something that couldn't be taken away by weather or circumstance. His words painted pictures of a future that seemed both impossible and achingly real. "What would you build?" Grace asked one night, genuinely curious. She was rewrapping his leg, her fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "A ranch, maybe. Not like my father's, always one bad season away from ruin. Something sustainable, with good water rights and enough land to weather the hard years." Kyle's eyes grew distant. "A house with a real foundation. Rooms for a family." Grace's hand stilled for just a moment. "That sounds nice. What about you? What do you want?" No one had ever asked her that before. Grace considered the question while she tied off the bandage. "I want to feel useful," she said finally. "I want to do something that matters. Running the store is fine, but sometimes I wonder if there's something more." "You're already doing something that matters," Kyle said quietly. "You're keeping me alive." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning that neither of them was quite ready to examine too closely. Grace gathered up the soiled bandages and carried them to the basin, needing something to do with her hands. 3 weeks after the shooting, Kyle's brother arrived from Carson City. Kevin Patterson was taller than Kyle, with the same dark hair but lighter eyes, and his face was etched with worry when Thomas showed him to the back room. Grace was there, having just finished the morning cleaning of the wound. "Good Lord, Kyle," Kevin breathed, taking in his brother's gaunt appearance. "I thought you were supposed to be recovering." "I am," Kyle insisted, though he looked exhausted even from the simple effort of sitting up straighter. "Just taking longer than expected." Kevin's eyes found Grace, questioning. She gestured for him to follow her out to the main room of the store, leaving the brothers their privacy for a moment. In the sunlit space between the shelves and barrels, she explained everything: the persistent inflammation, Dr. Willis's puzzlement, her own daily efforts to keep the wound clean and fighting infection. "He should be better by now," Kevin said, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't right." "I know." Grace crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "I'm doing everything I can. I'm not blaming you, miss. From what I can see, you've probably saved his life more than once already." Kevin's expression softened. "I just meant that maybe he needs to be somewhere with better medical facilities. Virginia City has a hospital now, with trained nurses and real equipment." The suggestion made logical sense, but something in Grace's chest constricted at the thought of Kyle leaving. She'd grown accustomed to his presence, to the rhythm of their conversations, to the way his face lit up when she entered the room. But she couldn't let her own feelings interfere with what might be best for him. "That's something you should discuss with him and Dr. Willis," she said evenly. But Kyle refused to go. When Kevin brought it up that evening, he was adamant despite his weakened state. "I'm not being hauled to Virginia City like an invalid," Kyle argued. "The journey alone might kill me in this condition, and Grace knows how to tend this wound better than anyone. I trust her." The simple statement of trust made Grace's heart do something complicated in her chest. She was standing in the doorway, having just brought fresh water, and Kyle's eyes met hers over his brother's shoulder. There was something in that gaze that spoke of more than gratitude, and Grace had to look away before her face betrayed her. Kevin stayed in Genoa for 3 days, sleeping at the boarding house down the street and spending his days with Kyle. Grace gave them space when she could, but still maintained her twice-daily routine of cleaning and dressing the wound. She noticed Kevin watching her work, seeing the gentleness in her hands, the way Kyle relaxed under her touch even though the cleaning process had to hurt. On the morning Kevin left, he pulled Grace aside while Kyle was sleeping. "He talks about you constantly," Kevin said without preamble. "When he's fevered, when he's lucid, makes no difference. It's always Grace this and Grace that." Grace felt heat rise to her cheeks. "He's grateful for the care, that's natural. It's more than gratitude." Kevin studied her face. "And unless I'm very much mistaken, you feel something for him too." She wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead she said, "He needs to get better first. Nothing else matters until then." "Fair enough." Kevin reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch heavy with coins. "For his care and for your family's hospitality. I'll be back in 2 weeks to check on him." Grace tried to refuse the money, but Kevin insisted, pressing it into her father's hands before climbing onto his horse. He rode north toward Carson City, and Grace returned to the back room to find Kyle awake and watching the door. "He's a good brother," Grace said, resuming her seat on the stool beside the cot. "The best." Kyle shifted, trying to find a more comfortable position. "What did he say to you? Just that he'd be back in 2 weeks?" Grace began preparing the supplies for the wound cleaning, a process so familiar now she could do it in her sleep. "Are you ready?" Kyle nodded, and Grace unwrapped the bandages. What she saw made her breath catch. The wound looked different. The inflammation seemed slightly less angry, the edges perhaps beginning to show the faintest signs of healthy tissue. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, but after weeks of stagnation, any change felt monumental. "Is something wrong?" Kyle asked, trying to see. "No," Grace said slowly, hardly daring to hope. "I think something might finally be right." She cleaned the wound with extra care that day, studying every inch of damaged flesh. By evening, she was more certain. The healing had begun, tentative and fragile but real. When Dr. Willis came by the next day, he confirmed her observation with barely concealed surprise. "Whatever you're doing, Miss Thompson, keep doing it," he said, examining the wound with his spectacles perched on his nose. "This is the first real progress we've seen." From that day forward, the improvement was steady if slow. The inflammation gradually receded, the wound began to close from the inside out, fresh pink tissue replacing the angry red that had persisted for so long. Kyle's strength returned in increments. First he could sit up without assistance, then stand for a few minutes, then walk the length of the back room using the wall for support. Grace continued her faithful routine, cleaning the wound every morning and evening without fail. But now the process was accompanied by cautious optimism, by smiles exchanged when they saw new progress, by Kyle's hand occasionally covering hers in wordless thanks. The touches lingered longer than necessary, fingers intertwining, neither of them acknowledging what was building between them but both of them feeling it. "I've been thinking," Kyle said one evening in mid-August, nearly 6 weeks after the shooting. He was sitting on the edge of the cot, his injured legs stretched out before him while Grace worked. "About what happens when I'm well enough to leave." The words sent a chill through Grace despite the summer heat. She focused on tying the bandage, not trusting herself to look at him. "Carson City is waiting for you. Your brother's there." Carson City was never really the destination, Kyle said quietly. "It was just somewhere to go because I didn't have anywhere else, but I've been thinking maybe I've found where I'm supposed to be." Grace's hand stilled. The lamp cast shadows across the small room, and somewhere outside a dog was barking. "Kyle, let me finish." He reached out and gently took her hand, stopping her work. "I know the circumstances aren't ideal. I'm a man with nothing but a horse and whatever's left in my saddlebags. I got shot in the street and you've had to play nursemaid for weeks. But Grace, these past weeks have been the best of my life despite everything, because I've gotten to know you. Your kindness, your strength, the way you never gave up even when this wound seemed like it would never heal. I don't want to lose that when I leave this room." Grace finally met his eyes, her heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm falling in love with you." The words were simple, direct, without artifice. "And I think maybe you might feel something for me too, though God knows you shouldn't based on how we met." "I do," Grace whispered, the admission escaping before she could stop it. "Feel something for you. But Kyle, you've been here in this room, barely able to walk. The real world is out there, and you might feel differently once you're back in it. Then let me prove it to you." Kyle's grip on her hand tightened. "Let me stay in Genoa. I'll find work, I'll court you properly, I'll show you this isn't just gratitude or fever dreams. I'll show you it's real." Grace wanted to say yes immediately, but caution held her back. You need to finish healing first. You need to be strong enough to make that decision clearly. I'm clear-headed enough to know what I want." But Kyle nodded, accepting her wisdom. "All right, I'll wait until I'm fully recovered. But then, Grace Thompson, I'm courting you whether you like it or not." She laughed despite herself, the tension breaking. "I think I might like it." The wound continued to heal, and with it, Kyle's mobility returned. By the end of August, he could walk the length of the store without limping too badly. In early September, he made it outside for the first time, leaning on a cane that the blacksmith had fashioned for him. Grace walked beside him, close enough to catch him if he stumbled, and they stood together in the late summer sunshine while Genoa bustled around them. "Feels like a lifetime since I saw the street from this angle," Kyle said, breathing in the dusty air. "Instead of from my back, bleeding out." "Don't remind me," Grace shuddered at the memory. "I still see it sometimes when I close my eyes, how pale you were, how much blood there was." Kyle turned to look at her, his expression serious. "I'm sorry you had to see that, but I'm not sorry it brought you to me." They stood there on the boardwalk, and Grace was acutely aware of the townsfolk passing by, of the curious glances and whispered conversations. News traveled fast in a small town, and everyone knew that Thomas Thompson's daughter had been tending to the wounded stranger for months now. Most seemed to approve, the women especially, who understood the devotion required to nurse someone through such an ordeal. But Grace knew there would be talk if Kyle stayed much longer without declaring his intentions formally. Kevin returned in mid-September as promised, and his face split into a genuine grin when he saw Kyle walking out to greet him, still using the cane but moving with confidence. The brothers embraced, and Kevin pulled back to examine Kyle with a critical eye. "You look like an actual human being now," Kevin declared. "Last time I saw you, I was half convinced I'd be arranging a funeral before the month was out. Grace wouldn't let that happen." Kyle glanced back at where Grace stood in the doorway of the store. "She's more stubborn than any infection." Over dinner that night at the boarding house, the three of them plus Thomas shared a meal, and Kyle laid out his intentions. He spoke clearly and honestly, addressing Thomas directly in the way frontier propriety demanded. "Sir, I'd like your permission to court your daughter," Kyle said. "I know I'm not in a position to offer much right now. I'll need to find work and save money before I can properly support a wife, but my intentions are honorable, and I love her. I want to build a life here in Genoa if she'll have me." Thomas regarded Kyle steadily, his weathered face unreadable. Grace held her breath, waiting. Finally, her father spoke. "You're a patient man, Kyle Patterson. Not many could endure what you've been through without complaint, and I've watched how you treat my daughter with respect and genuine affection. Far as I'm concerned, if Grace wants you courting her, you have my blessing." All eyes turned to Grace. She felt her face flush but met Kyle's gaze squarely. "Yes," she said simply. "I want that." The smile that broke across Kyle's face was worth every anxious moment. Kevin clapped his brother on the back, and Thomas called for whiskey to toast the arrangement. It was a small celebration in a frontier boarding house. Nothing fancy, but Grace felt happier than she had in years. Kyle found work at the livery stable, tending horses and repairing tack. The owner, a gruff man named Samuel who'd come to Nevada in the gold rush days, took a liking to Kyle's quiet competence and willingness to work hard despite his still healing leg. The pay wasn't much, but it was honest work, and Kyle threw himself into it with determination. The courtship proceeded in the old-fashioned way. Kyle came to Sunday dinners at the Thompson home, sat in the parlor with Grace while Thomas read his newspaper within earshot, walked with her through town on Sunday afternoons when the store was closed. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's habits and dreams, building the foundation of something lasting. Grace still cleaned Kyle's wound. though now it was nearly healed, just a puckered scar that needed occasional attention. These moments were private and intimate, Kyle sitting in the back room of the store while Grace tended to him with the same careful attention she'd shown from the beginning. They talked in low voices, and sometimes Kyle would catch her hand and press it to his lips, and Grace would feel warmth spread through her entire body. "Does it still hurt?" she asked one October evening, examining the scar by lamplight. The wound had finally closed completely, the last stubborn section healing over in the past week. "Sometimes it aches when the weather changes," Kyle admitted, "but it's nothing compared to those first weeks. I remember lying there thinking I might die in the back room of a general store, never having really lived at all. And then I'd see you coming with your basin and bandages, and I'd think maybe I was going to make it after all." "You were always going to make it," Grace said, though she wasn't sure that was true. There had been dark days when she genuinely feared losing him. "You're too stubborn to die. Takes one to know one." Kyle caught her hand before she could pull away, lacing their fingers together. "Grace, I know we haven't been courting long by conventional standards, but we've spent more time together than most courting couples do in a year. I know you, the real you, not just the face you show the world, and I want to marry you." Grace's breath caught. "Kyle." "I'm not asking yet," he continued quickly. "I know I need to save more money, find us a place to live, do this properly, but I wanted you to know where this is heading, that this isn't just courting for courting's sake. I'm building toward something, toward us." "I know," Grace whispered. "I want that too." They sat together in the lamplight, hands intertwined, the past and future converging in that quiet moment. Outside, Genoa settled into evening, the sounds of the frontier town drifting through the window. Horses and wagons, raised voices from the saloons, the distant whistle of a train heading west. Winter came to Nevada, cold and sharp. Kyle moved into a small room above the livery stable, saving every penny he could. Grace continued working at the store, but now her days had new brightness to them, knowing Kyle would come by in the evenings after work. They'd walk together when the weather permitted, bundled against the cold, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Kevin visited for Christmas, bringing gifts and good news. He'd struck a decent vein of silver and wanted Kyle to consider joining him in the mining business. But Kyle declined gently, explaining that his life was in Genoa now. Kevin took it well, seeming unsurprised by his brother's choice. At dinner, he regaled them with stories of Virginia City's growth, the new buildings going up, the wealth flowing through the territory. "It's exciting," Kevin admitted, "but it's also chaotic and violent. Men kill each other over claims regularly. Honestly, I think you've got the better situation here, Kyle. Quieter town, honest work, a woman who loves you." "I know I do," Kyle agreed, his hand finding Grace's under the table. As winter gave way to spring of 1874, Kyle's savings had grown enough that he felt confident making the next step. On a mild March evening, he asked Thomas for formal permission to marry Grace. They sat in the store after closing, and Kyle laid out his finances honestly, showing he could support a wife, explaining his plans to save for a small house, demonstrating his commitment to building a stable life. Thomas listened carefully, then extended his hand. "You're a good man, Kyle Patterson. Take care of my daughter." "With my life," Kyle promised. He proposed to Grace that same evening, leading her out behind the store where the first spring flowers were beginning to push through the soil. He'd bought a simple gold band from the jeweler, spending more than he probably should have, but wanting to give her something real, something lasting. "Grace Thompson," he said, dropping to one knee despite the ache it still sometimes caused in his scarred leg, "you saved my life in every way that matters. You tended my body when it was broken, and you gave my heart something to beat for. Will you marry me?" Grace's eyes filled with tears as she nodded. Yes, absolutely yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. When Kyle stood, Grace threw her arms around him and they held each other as the Nevada sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It had been 9 months since that terrible day when he'd been shot. 9 months of pain and healing and slowly falling in love. Now they were standing on the threshold of something new. They married in May, in the small church that served Genoa and the surrounding ranches. Grace wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and carried wildflowers that grew in the meadows outside town. Kyle wore his best suit, still a bit threadbare but clean and pressed, and the smile on his face when Grace walked down the aisle made her feel like the most beautiful woman in the world. Kevin served as best man, having traveled from Carson City for the occasion. Several of Grace's friends from town stood up with her, and the church was full of well-wishers who'd watched their courtship unfold. Dr. Willis was there, looking pleased with himself as though he'd personally orchestrated the whole thing. Samuel from the livery stable sat in the back, nodding approvingly when the minister pronounced them husband and wife. The reception was held at the boarding house, the owner having cleared out the dining room for dancing and celebration. There was food and music, fiddles and guitars playing lively tunes that had people spinning across the floor. Grace danced with Kyle, with her father, with Kevin, and finally with Kyle again as the evening wound down. "How does it feel to be Mrs. Patterson?" Kyle murmured in her ear as they swayed to a slower song. "Like coming home," Grace replied truthfully. They spent their wedding night in the room above the livery stable that Kyle had been renting, and if it wasn't fancy, it was theirs. Kyle was gentle and patient, mindful of Grace's inexperience, and when they finally lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Grace traced the scar on his thigh with wondering fingers. "Does it bother you?" Kyle asked quietly. "The scar, the fact that I'll probably always limp a bit when I'm tired." "No," Grace said firmly. "It's part of you, part of our story. I'm just grateful it healed." "Because you wouldn't give up on it," Kyle reminded her. "Every single day, no matter how hopeless it seemed, you were there. That kind of dedication, that's who you are, Grace. That's why I love you." They made love again, slowly and sweetly, learning each other's bodies the way they'd learned each other's hearts. Later, as Grace drifted toward sleep in her husband's arms, she thought about that day 9 months ago when a stranger had collapsed outside her father's store. She'd never imagined then where that moment would lead, never dreamed that the wounded man she'd tended would become the center of her world. Thomas gifted them a parcel of land on the edge of town as a wedding present, 2 acres with good water access and room to build. Kyle and Grace threw themselves into the work of constructing their home, aided by friends and neighbors in the frontier tradition of barn raising. Kevin came down from Carson City for a week to help, and together the brothers framed out a modest house with 2 bedrooms, a real kitchen, and a sitting room with windows facing west to catch the sunset. Grace continued working at the store while Kyle worked at the livery, and in the evenings they'd go to their property and work on the house. By July, it was habitable, and they moved in with a sense of triumph. The furniture was mostly secondhand, pieced together from various sources, but Grace made curtains and cushions and Kyle built shelves and a table, and slowly the house became a home. Their first dinner in their own place was simple, bread and stew eaten at their own table by lamplight. Kyle raised his glass of water in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said. "To healing," Grace added, clinking her glass against his. They settled into married life with ease, their relationship already built on months of deep connection. Grace discovered she enjoyed keeping house, found satisfaction in creating a space that was truly theirs. Kyle proved handy at all manner of repairs and improvements, his skills expanding as he took on new challenges. On Sundays, they'd often ride out to explore the surrounding countryside, Kyle having recovered enough that he could sit a horse without too much discomfort. One Sunday, in late summer, they rode to a meadow in the foothills where wildflowers bloomed in profusion. They spread a blanket and lay together watching clouds drift across the vast Nevada sky. Grace's head rested on Kyle's shoulder, her hand over the scar on his leg, almost unconsciously protective. "I've been thinking," Kyle said idly, "about buying some cattle, starting a small herd." Samuel mentioned he might sell the livery in a few years, retire to California to be near his daughter. "If I bought it, we'd have a steady income, and the cattle could be a side venture." "That sounds ambitious," Grace said, but she was smiling. She loved seeing Kyle dream, watching him plan for their future. "Too ambitious? No, I think you can do anything you set your mind to." Grace propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "You survived a wound that should have killed you or at least cost you the leg. You built us a house. You won my father's approval and my heart. Cattle and a livery stable seem entirely within your capabilities." Kyle laughed, pulling her down for a kiss. They made love there in the meadow, surrounded by flowers and sky, and Grace thought that this was happiness, this simple perfect moment with the man she loved. In October, Grace realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Childbirth was dangerous on the frontier, and she'd lost her own mother years ago. But Dr. Willis assured her she was healthy and strong, and Kyle's excitement was infectious. He immediately began making plans for the second bedroom, building a cradle from smooth pine, talking about their child as though it was already real and present. "Boy or girl, doesn't matter to me," Kyle said one evening, running his hand over Grace's still flat stomach. "As long as they're healthy and they have your stubbornness." "My stubbornness," Grace protested. "You're the one who refused to die despite all logic saying you should. Learned it from you." Kyle kissed her, soft and lingering. "Everything good in my life I learned from you." Winter was mild that year, for which Grace was grateful as her pregnancy progressed. By spring of 1875, she was visibly showing, and the women of Genoa rallied around her the way frontier communities did, bringing food and advice and hand-sewn baby clothes. Kyle was attentive to the point of being overprotective, insisting Grace rest whenever possible, taking over more of the household chores despite working full days at the livery. The baby came on a warm May evening, almost exactly a year after their wedding. Dr. Willis attended with two of the town's experienced mothers acting as midwives. Kyle paced outside, nearly wearing a path in the grass, until finally he heard the thin cry of a newborn and was allowed inside. Grace was exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in soft cloth. "It's a boy," she said, her voice hoarse from hours of labor. "A healthy boy." Kyle approached almost reverently, looking down at his son's red, wrinkled face. "He's perfect," he breathed. They named him Thomas after Grace's father, with Kyle as his middle name. Little Thomas was a good baby, eating well and sleeping in predictable stretches, and Grace recovered quickly from the birth. Kyle took to fatherhood naturally, walking the floor with his son at night, changing nappies without complaint, staring at the baby with such naked love that it made Grace's heart ache. "I never thought I'd have this," Kyle admitted one night, holding Thomas while Grace rested. "A wife, a home, a child. After my family lost everything in Texas, I thought I was destined to just drift from place to place. And then I got shot in Genoa, Nevada, and found everything I'd been looking for." "Funny how life works," Grace murmured, watching her husband and son with deep contentment. "If those men hadn't shot you, you would have ridden right through town. We never would have met." "Then I'm grateful to have been shot," Kyle said seriously, "if that's what it took to bring me to you." As Thomas grew, the Patterson household thrived. Kyle did eventually buy the livery stable when Samuel retired in 1876, and the business provided steady income. Grace helped with the bookkeeping while caring for Thomas, who proved to be a bright, energetic child with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined spirit. In 1877, Grace became pregnant again, and this time delivered a daughter they named Catherine, though they called her Katie from the start. She was smaller than Thomas had been, but just as healthy, with a shock of blonde hair that surprised them both until Grace remembered her mother had been fair. Their family felt complete with 2 children, and the next years passed in the comfortable rhythm of frontier life. Kyle's leg occasionally troubled him, especially in cold or damp weather, and Grace would tend to it the way she'd done at the beginning, massaging the scar tissue, applying warm compresses. These moments were intimate and familiar, a callback to the beginning of their story. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved horses and spent hours at the livery stable with his father. Katie was more adventurous, climbing trees and demanding to be taught to ride almost before she could walk properly. Grace ran the household and helped at the general store when her father needed assistance, and Kyle built the livery business into one of the most reputable in the region. In 1880, Kevin finally married, bringing his bride Clara to Genoa to meet the family. The 2 couples became close, with Kevin and Clara visiting regularly and eventually relocating to Genoa in 1882. When Kevin decided mining was a young man's game, and he'd rather go into business with his brother. Together, the Patterson brothers expanded the livery into a full stable and freight operation, serving the growing needs of the territory. On their 10th wedding anniversary, in May of 1884, Kyle and Grace rode back out to the meadow where they'd once spent that perfect Sunday afternoon. The children were with their grandfather for the day, giving the couple rare time alone. They spread a blanket in nearly the same spot, and Grace leaned against Kyle's chest while he wrapped his arms around her. 10 years, Grace marveled. "Sometimes it feels like yesterday I was cleaning your wound in the back room of the store, and sometimes it feels like you've been part of my life forever." "Both things are true," Kyle said. "Time is strange that way." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I told you back then that I was falling in love with you. I was right, but I didn't understand the half of it. I've fallen more in love with you every single day since. Even when I was enormous and pregnant and cranky, especially then." Kyle turned her in his arms so he could see her face. "You gave me everything, Grace. Not just saved my life, though God knows you did that. You gave me purpose and home and family. You gave me a reason to be better than I was." Grace touched his face, tracing the lines that years and weather had etched there. He was 36 now, still handsome, stronger and more settled than the wounded stranger she'd met 11 years ago. "You gave me just as much. Before you, I was going through the motions, helping my father, waiting for something without knowing what. You were what I was waiting for." They made love there in the meadow, unhurried and deep, reaffirming the bonds that had only grown stronger with time. Afterward, they lay tangled together, watching clouds drift overhead just as they had years before. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked suddenly. "Staying here instead of moving on like you'd planned. You had dreams of building something bigger." "I did build something bigger," Kyle replied immediately. Maybe not a sprawling ranch or a fortune in silver, but something that matters more. I built a life with you, a family, a place in a community. I've got my name on a business, children who'll carry on after I'm gone, and the love of the most extraordinary woman I've ever known. That's bigger than any dream I had before." Grace smiled, satisfied. She'd needed to hear it, needed the confirmation that Kyle didn't feel trapped or limited by the choices they'd made together. As Nevada grew and changed around them, the Patterson family remained rooted in Genoa. Thomas took over more responsibilities at the livery as he got older, showing a natural head for business. Katie surprised them by showing interest in medicine, spending time with Dr. Willis when he'd allow it, learning about herbs and treatments. The old doctor, now in his 70s, seemed pleased to have an apprentice of sorts. In 1887, Grace found herself unexpectedly pregnant again at 36. The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, and both Kyle and Dr. Willis worried. But Grace was as stubborn as ever, refusing to let fear dominate her experience. In early 1888, she delivered another son, smaller than his siblings had been but healthy and howling with impressive lungs. They named him Samuel, after the man who'd given Kyle his first job in Genoa and who had recently passed away. Little Sam was doted on by his older siblings, particularly Katie, who was 10, and thrilled to have a baby brother to fuss over. The years continued their steady march. Thomas married in 1891, bringing his bride Elizabeth to live in a house they built on a corner of Kyle and Grace's property. Katie, against all frontier convention, left for San Francisco in 1893 to attend a nursing school that had opened there, promising to return and help serve the medical needs of the territory. Sam grew up in a household that was comfortable and secure, never knowing the hardship his father had experienced as a young man. Kyle's leg continued to ache as he aged, the old wound a permanent reminder of how their story had begun. He walked with a slight limp now that became more pronounced when he was tired, and Grace would massage it in the evenings while they sat by the fire. The scar was smooth and silver, decades old but still visible, still a part of him. "Does it bother you?" Grace asked one evening in 1895, working her fingers over the familiar tissue. They were in their early 50s now, their hair showing gray, their bodies marked by years of hard work and child rearing. "Not the way you mean," Kyle said. "Sometimes I'm grateful for it, actually. It brought me to you. Every time it aches, I remember that day and how my whole life changed in that moment." "You could have died," Grace said softly, still haunted by the memory all these years later. "But I didn't. You wouldn't let me." Kyle reached down and took her hand, pulling her up from the floor to sit beside him on the settee. "You cleaned that wound every single day for months, never giving up even when it seemed hopeless. That's who you are, Grace. You don't give up on things you love." "Or people," Grace corrected, leaning into his shoulder. "I don't give up on people I love." They sat together in comfortable silence, the fire crackling, the house quiet around them. Thomas and Elizabeth's children, their grandchildren, often filled the house with noise during the day, but the evenings belonged to just Kyle and Grace, time carved out for each other after decades of partnership. In 1898, Katie returned from San Francisco with a nursing degree and a husband, a doctor named Michael who was eager to establish a practice in the growing territory. Together, they opened a small clinic in Genoa, bringing modern medicine to the town. Katie had learned well, and Grace often watched her daughter work with a mixture of pride and recognition, seeing her own dedication to healing reflected in the younger woman. Sam, now 10, was still deciding what path he'd take. He liked horses like his father, but he also showed an interest in his Aunt Katie's medical work. Kyle told him there was time to figure it out, that life had a way of showing you where you were meant to be. As the new century approached, Kyle and Grace found themselves reflecting more on the past. They'd lived through tremendous changes, seen Nevada grow from wild territory to established state, watched technologies like the railroad and telegraph transform the frontier. But some things remained constant: their love, their family, their commitment to the community they'd built their lives in. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1899, the whole family gathered for a celebration. Thomas and Elizabeth were there with their 4 children. Katie and Michael came with their infant daughter. Kevin and Clara traveled from the next county, where they'd moved to be near Clara's aging parents. Sam, now nearly 12, helped organize the festivities with the seriousness he brought to everything. The gathering was held at the Patterson house, expanded over the years to accommodate family celebrations. There was food and music, stories and laughter, children running through the rooms while adults caught up on news and gossip. At one point, Kevin called for quiet and proposed a toast. "To Kyle and Grace," he said, raising his glass. "25 years ago, my brother was shot in the street like a dog, and we all thought he was done for. But Grace Thompson looked at a dying stranger and decided he was worth saving. She cleaned his wound every single day for months, never gave up even when it seemed hopeless. And somewhere in all that tending and healing, they fell in love. It's the most unlikely, most beautiful story I know, and I'm honored to have witnessed it." Everyone drank to the toast, and Grace felt tears prick her eyes. Kyle squeezed her hand, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "I'd like to add something," Kyle said, standing up with effort, his bad leg stiff from sitting. "Grace saved my life, that's true. But more than that, she gave me a life worth saving. Everything good I have, everything I am, flows from that day she knelt beside me in the dust and decided I mattered. I've spent 25 years trying to be worthy of that decision, and I'll spend whatever years I have left doing the same. Grace, you are my heart. You are my home. I love you more today than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today." Grace couldn't stop the tears then, and she didn't try. She stood and embraced her husband, not caring that everyone was watching, and Kyle held her close. The room erupted in applause and cheers, and their grandchildren laughed with delight at their grandparents' display of affection. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Kyle and Grace sat on the porch of their house, watching the stars emerge in the Nevada sky. Grace had her head on Kyle's shoulder, and his arm was around her waist, and they were quiet in the way only long married couples can be, comfortable in the silence. "You remember that first night?" Grace asked suddenly. "After you were shot, when I sat up with you because your fever was so high." "I remember pieces," Kyle admitted. "Mostly I remember being terrified and in pain, and then seeing your face in the lamplight and feeling like maybe I'd be all right. You kept apologizing," Grace recalled, "for bleeding on the floor, for being a burden. You were half delirious with fever, and you were worried about inconveniencing us." "Sounds like something I'd do," Kyle chuckled. "Even dying, I was trying to be polite." "You weren't dying," Grace said firmly. "I wouldn't let you, I know." Kyle pressed a kiss to her hair. "You never let me do anything you didn't approve of. It's very annoying." Grace laughed, the sound bright in the darkness. "You don't seem to mind too much." "I don't mind at all," Kyle said seriously. "Grace, I mean it when I say you saved me, not just from the gunshot wound, though that too. You saved me from a life of drifting, from loneliness, from becoming bitter and hard like too many men out here do. You gave me softness and love and family, things I'd stopped believing I could have. I'm not exaggerating when I say you're the best thing that ever happened to me." "The feeling is mutual," Grace whispered. "Before you, I was just existing, going through motions. You gave me purpose, passion, a reason to wake up excited for the day ahead. These 25 years with you have been the best of my life." They sat together under the stars, two people who had found each other against impossible odds and built something lasting. The wound that had brought them together was long healed, leaving only a scar and a story, and the love they'd discovered during those long months of tending and healing had grown into something vast and enduring. As the new century dawned in 1900, Kyle and Grace entered their 50s secure in their love and their place in the world. Sam decided to follow in Katie's footsteps and pursue medicine, leaving for school in San Francisco in 1902. Thomas continued running the livery business, now with help from his eldest son. Katie's clinic thrived, and she often consulted with Grace about herbal remedies and traditional treatments, the two women bridging old frontier wisdom with new medical knowledge. Kyle's health remained good despite the old injury, and Grace stayed active helping with the grandchildren and maintaining their home. They'd grown old together, their faces lined and their bodies slower, but the connection between them only deepened with time. Kyle still looked at Grace like she hung the moon, and Grace still tended to Kyle's old wound with gentle hands when it pained him. In 1905, they celebrated their 30th anniversary with a quieter gathering, just immediate family. Kyle was 57 now, Grace 54, and they both felt the weight of years. But they also felt the richness of a life fully lived, of love given and returned, of family built and community served. 30 years, Kyle marveled that evening, alone with Grace in their bedroom. "When you found me bleeding in the street, did you ever imagine we'd be here?" "No," Grace admitted. "I just knew I had to help you. I couldn't walk past someone in need." "Lucky for me." Kyle settled into bed beside her, pulling her close. "I got shot in exactly the right town at exactly the right time, found the exact right woman to save me." "It wasn't luck," Grace said. "It was fate. We were meant to find each other, even if it took a gunshot wound to make it happen." They fell asleep wrapped around each other the way they had for 3 decades, two lives completely intertwined. Outside, Genoa slept around them, the town they'd helped build and sustain through their work and presence. The livery business Kyle had built still served the community. The general store Thomas Thompson had founded was now run by his grandson, Grace and Kyle's eldest child. Katie's clinic provided care for the whole region. The Patterson name meant something in this corner of Nevada, meant stability and dedication and honest dealing. Kyle's leg wound, the injury that had seemed like it would never heal, had become just another part of their history, a story they told their grandchildren when asked about how they'd met. The scar remained, faded but present, a physical reminder of the day their lives had intersected and changed forever. In the years that followed, Kyle and Grace continued their steady life together. They weathered the challenges that came with aging, the aches and pains, the gradual slowing. They celebrated as their children and grandchildren thrived, as Genoa continued to grow and prosper. They sat on their porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the Nevada landscape they both loved, and counted themselves blessed. Kyle passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1912, at the age of 64, his body finally giving out after years of hard work and a lifetime shaped by that near-fatal injury 4 decades earlier. Grace held his hand as he drew his last breath, and even through her grief, she felt grateful. They'd had nearly 40 years together, had built a life and family from nothing, had loved each other completely. But that was far in the future from 1900, still years away from their story's end. For now, Grace and Kyle had many more sunrises and sunsets to share, many more evenings on the porch, many more moments of quiet companionship that defined a marriage built on more than just love, though there was plenty of that. Their marriage was built on dedication, on the kind of commitment that tends to a wound every day until it heals, that doesn't give up when things seem hopeless. The wound had healed, but the love it had kindled continued burning bright, a flame that would last both their lifetimes and beyond, living on in the family they'd created and the legacy they'd built in the dusty frontier town of Genoa, Nevada. Their story was the kind that frontier people told around fires, a romance born of adversity and dedication, of stubbornness and faith, of one woman's refusal to let a stranger die and one man's gratitude that transformed into the deepest love. And every time Kyle's leg ached, every time Grace touched the old scar with familiar tenderness, they remembered. They remembered the beginning, the pain and uncertainty and gradual healing. They remembered falling in love while infection raged and hope seemed lost. They remembered choosing each other, again and again, in 1,000 small ways that added up to a lifetime. The wound had healed because Grace wouldn't let it fester, because she showed up every morning and every evening with clean bandages and gentle hands and stubborn determination. And their love had thrived for the same reasons, tended daily with care and attention, and a refusal to let anything tear them apart. That was their story. That was their legacy. And it all started with a bullet wound in the dusty street of a frontier town, and a woman who decided a stranger's life was worth fighting for. Everything else, the romance and marriage and family and long life together, flowed from that one decision, that one moment of compassion that changed 2 lives forever.